Warm welcome to this launch of the interim economic outlook. The global economy is starting to turn the corner with declining inflation and robust trade growth. Since the release of our previous economic outlook in May, global growth has evolved broadly in line with our projections, continuing its steady path in the first half of this year. Purchasing managers' indices suggest that growth remained steady in July and August, mainly driven by services sectors. The continued decline in inflation over the past 1.5 years has been a key factor behind the resilience of growth. Inflation is now at or close to central banks' targets in around 80% of OECD economies. That is a massive improvement from early last year, when all OECD economies had inflation rates that were more than 1 percentage point above central banks' targets. There are several reasons for our assessment that global growth will continue its steady path looking ahead. First, household incomes and spending are being supported by the decline in inflation and recovering real wages growth. The fall in oil prices and reduced food price inflation boost the purchasing power of households. Labour demand, while lower than at its post-pandemic highs, is still strong, supporting wages growth. Second, financial conditions, though still restrictive, are easing. Investors are anticipating a further normalisation of monetary policy. Issuance of corporate bonds has picked up and credit growth has started to recover. Third, global trade continues its recovery. In the first half of this year, trade was driven by strong growth in the United States and in key emerging market economies, including Brazil, China, and India. Forward-looking indicators such as containerized freight, air freight, and passenger volumes signal robust demand, though survey measures of export orders have weakened. At 3.2%, we expect global growth to remain resilient both in 2024 and 2025, following growth of 3.1% last year. For 2024, this is up slightly by 0.1 of a percentage point from the forecast in our economic outlook in May. For 2025, our projection remains unchanged. For the United States, growth is expected to slow but to be cushioned by monetary policy easing, with growth projected at 2.6% this year and 1.6% next year. For the euro area, GDP is expected to expand by 0.7% in 2024 and 1.3% in 2025, with activity supported by the recovery in real incomes and improvements in credit availability. For Japan, we expect strong wage gains to offset the impact of tight macroeconomic policy, with output expanding by 1.4% in 2025, following a small contraction of 0.1% in 2024. Economic prospects in most emerging market economies are projected to remain stable. We expect robust growth in Brazil, India, and Indonesia. For China, growth is projected to slow to 4.9% this year and 4.5% next year, reflecting subdued consumption spending and corrections in the real estate sector. Inflation is projected to continue its decline from past peaks. We project average inflation across G20 countries of 5.4% in 2024 and 3.3% in 2025, down from 6.1% last year. By the end of 2025, we expect inflation to be back to central bank targets in most G20 economies. The uncertainty around the projected outlook for growth and inflation is still significant. Service price inflation continues to be high, with the risk that inflation may not decline as rapidly as projected. There's also still the risk that growth slows as labour markets ease. Geopolitical and trade tensions remain heightened and could further disrupt supply chains or energy markets. Another risk to global growth is that about half of low-income countries are in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. On the upside, a strong real wage growth could boost consumer confidence and household consumption more than expected, and a further fall in oil prices could accelerate the decline in inflation. As the global economy appears to be turning the corner, the policy priorities are to use the room provided by declining inflation to lower policy interest rates while ensuring inflation is durably reduced. Rebuild fiscal space to preserve room to respond to future shocks and to help meet future spending pressures. And boost medium-term growth prospects, including through competition-enhancing reforms. Monetary policy rate reductions should continue as inflation moderates, though central banks will need to balance policy rate cuts with the need to ensure that inflationary pressures are indeed durably contained. Policy rate reductions should remain data dependent and be carefully calibrated. On fiscal policy, policy action needs to reduce public debt ratios. Public debt across the OECD stood at 113% of GDP last year, up from 73% back in 2007. We need to do more to better control expenditures, or growth in expenditures, improving spending efficiency, reallocate spending to areas that better support opportunities and growth, and to optimize tax revenues. Ambitious reforms are needed to strengthen the foundations for medium-term growth. Improving competition and the business environment will be important to promote productivity, innovation, employment, and consequently higher living standards. In July, we launched the update of the OECD product market regulation indicators, building on our long-standing work on product market competition and regulations. The product market regulation indicators are a key policy tool that helps countries compare the effectiveness of their regulatory policies with those in other countries. And based on our assessment, the OECD countries with the most competition-friendly regulatory regime are Lithuania, Sweden, Ireland, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. These 5 countries come closest to international best practice overall. The data and information we collected highlights key areas for country-specific reform, for example, easing the administrative requirements to establish a new firm or reducing regulatory barriers in services and network sectors. Improving policy effectiveness to help boost employment and reinvigorate productivity growth will of course be important in other areas as well. For example, to ensure we have the right policies in place to address labour and skills shortages and to enhance investment and infrastructure. Thank you, and with that I pass the floor to our Chief Economist Alvaro Pereira to deliver the detail of our analysis.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. Good morning, everyone. We're going to present what Secretary General mentioned. It's a picture of resilient growth, declining inflation. So we think in many countries we are starting to turn a corner in terms of inflation, but also important to highlight in terms of messages. It's also time for us to turn the corner on fiscal policy, in particular because of the debts that we have, and also time to turn the corner on reform. So let me walk you through about the details of our presentation. So first of all, as you can see, growth remains resilient. This graph basically tells you that our growth forecast for this year next is going to be about 3.2%, with the MEs growing a bit more than advanced economies as expected. But you can see that growth remains resilient in spite of, remember, put things into perspective. We just had a pandemic 5 years ago, a pandemic that was the biggest in a century, and we also had the biggest energy crisis, especially in Europe, that since the 1970s. So in spite of this, growth has been resilient. On the other hand, important to say, we've been worried about inflation in the past few years, and you can see in this graph that headline inflation, which is in the blue line, continues to come down. So that means goods inflation and the rest of the parts of inflation is coming down, but also in terms of core inflation, which has been our main concern. Remember, core inflation is inflation minus taking away basically food prices and energy prices. And core inflation has been stickier, which means it's coming down slower, but it's coming down. So that means it's moving in the right direction. We're still worried, as I'll highlight a bit later, about service price inflation, but you can see that inflation is moving the right direction. And I think it's important to praise the work of central banks, because their tightening of monetary policy is bearing fruits, and the proof is exactly in these graphs. Another issue that we have right now is that labor markets are easing, and this graph shows in many countries that job vacancies are coming down, and this puts it into perspective. And in spite of very significant monetary tightening, we know that besides labor markets easing, we also know that unemployment rates continue to be historically low. We had just a slight increase in unemployment rates in the past few months, but we continue to have very resilient labor markets going forward. However, as we all know, we've been concerned. A lot of people around the world are concerned about, and they feel the pinch when they go shopping, in particular because of the very large increase in food prices. And we took a look, in fact, what is happening regarding this. So we compared pre-pandemic with post-pandemic food prices and compare them to basically compensation growth, so wages. And what you can see in this graph is that in many countries, food prices still went up and continue to be higher than they were regarding vis-a-vis wages. And so you look at what happens to South Africa or Germany or Spain or Italy, you know, when people are saying there's kind of sometimes the economy is doing well, but they still don't feel it in their pockets. This is one of the proofs that this is happening. You know, food prices continue with regards to wages, continue to be high. And if you look at real wages, this new graph shows you the real wages. You can see that in Brazil, in the United States, Spain, and Canada, there's been a recovery in terms of real wages. But in many other countries, compared to pre-pandemic levels, real wages have not recovered. And so it's very likely that this will happen in the next few months. The Secretary General mentioned something that we think is very important. Trade has surprised on the upside in the first few quarters of this year. And in fact, when you look at not only freight volumes, but also passenger volumes, you can see that due to the tourism boom in many countries, due to lively trade, you can see that trade continues to do well, and this is good news for the world economy. So let me just walk you through in a couple of main forecasts that we have. These are the new forecasts that we have for the G20 countries. I would like to start with highlighting that the United States continues to have a very robust economy, growing very strongly this year and the next. And so the United States, we believe that will continue to do well, also in terms of the labor market. So strong growth in the United States. On the other hand, you can see that in the European Union, growth is more subdued this year. Remember, I'll go back to what I was saying before. The energy crisis was the biggest since the 1970s. This hit, in particular, the European economy, and growth continues to be very subdued. Consumption is starting to recover. We don't have very strong investment in many countries, but you can see that we are forecasting that for next year, growth is going to be a bit stronger in Europe, about 1.3%. But certain economies are still not doing as good as we would like, including Germany. Others are doing much better, like Spain, Eastern Europe, parts of Southern Europe. So there's many Europes as well, but you know, you can see that next year we expect that growth will pick up in Europe as well. I would like also to highlight that Japan had a bad reading in terms of GDP in the first quarter, but its growth has been robust and continues to be robust this year. We expect, and especially next year. And we can see that also in Asia, that China growth will be lower than 5% this year, 4.5% next year. We are still concerned what is happening right now regarding the real estate market. The adjustment continues to be difficult, even though the manufacturing system and the manufacturing exports of China are doing fairly well. But I would like also to highlight a few shining lights of our forecast. You look at the growth, very resilient in Brazil, very strong also in China, in India and in Indonesia. So many emerging market economies are carrying the load in terms of growth of the world economy, and this is good news. In terms of inflation, these are our forecasts for 24 and 25. You can see that the inflation is coming down in virtually all the countries of the world that we follow, and they will be very close to target next year. In fact, as the Secretary General mentioned, right now 4 out of 5 countries of OECD countries are now, with less than 1% of their target inflation less 1% of their target. And so that means that we are moving in the right direction, as I said. So let me just now focus on risks. Remember, we have a big risk that we think that is important to highlight is obviously the geopolitical risk. We've been concerned about geopolitical risks, and we think that in particular an escalation of the conflicts in the Middle East will certainly have an impact on trade and energy prices. But other risks that I would like to highlight are, first of all, if we think that, for example, like it happened in certain countries, Mexico, Canada, Brazil, sometimes inflation is coming down, but you have a few readings that are not so positive. So sometimes central banks have to put a brake on the declining rates. And so it's possible, for a variety of reasons, that financial conditions could remain a bit restrictive going forward. And obviously this has an impact on credit growth and has an impact on the rest of the economy. On the other hand, we also know that, as I highlighted before, one of the reasons why we've been having inflation, especially core inflation, not coming down as fast as we would like, is coming down fine, but it could be faster, is partly because of service price inflation. And service price inflation, as you see in the red columns there, continues. It now dominates part of the inflation in most countries of the world. And service price inflation is stickier mostly because there's significant markups in many of the service sector, fast wage growth, and barriers to services. So I'll come back to that when we talk about the reforms that countries need to do. And another source of our concern is debt. As Secretary General mentioned, we have very high debt in many OECD countries, but also high debt and especially debt distress in many low-income countries and EMEs. What you can see, I just want you to pay attention to the green and the blue bars. It's basically saying that there's low risk of debt distress. And you can see that this green and blue shrinks in the past few years. In fact, since 2012, we had an increasing number of countries getting into high risk of distress or already in debt distress. And so obviously this has a big consequence for their countries and some volatility also in the markets. Let me turn now to policies. As the Secretary General mentioned, we think that in terms of monetary policy, since inflation is coming down, there's room to lower policy rates, but we also think that it's important to maintain prudence and to continue to be prudent. What do we mean by this? It means that very likely in the next few months, central banks will continue to pay a very close look at what happens to inflation, what happens in the labor markets, and so they will be very data dependent. Their decisions will be very data dependent. So prudence, we think that is quite important going forward. But as I said before, and the Secretary General highlighted very strongly, we think that an area in which we turn the corner is certainly on fiscal issues. Remember, fiscal means that many countries have very high debt levels already, the highest in peacetime for many countries around the world. But not only that, we know that the spending pressures are only increasing. We know that there's spending pressures for defense, there's spending pressures to spend on the green transition, and there's spending pressures with aging costs. We are all aging, and aging costs are increasing, which means that there'll be further pressures on our fiscal policies. That's why we think it is absolutely essential to become more prudent on fiscal policy and to be fiscally disciplined going forward so that you don't have problems down the line. But finally, I would like to highlight something that is absolutely essential, which is going back to reforms. Next graph is basically highlighting what the Secretary General mentioned, our new graphs on product market and our new indicators on product market regulation. Just to give you an idea, to get away from the economic jargon, what does this mean? It means that we take a snapshot of picture of every single economy and see whether you have too much red tape when you create firms, if you have too much red tape around the economy or too many administrative burdens, excessive procedures, whether you have too many barriers to competition, whether you have too many barriers to entry and entrepreneurship, and whether you have good lobbying regulations to make sure that everybody is in the same level playing field. And what this picture is telling you is that in the last 25 years, there's been a decline, basically, so we have been moving in the right direction. There's been a lot of reforms across the world, but in the last 10 years, that is not so. A few countries like Indonesia, Brazil, Greece have done some reforms, but most of the countries have not done reforms. I would like to highlight that the highest values here means that you are less competition friendly. There's more barriers, more complexity in terms of regulations. It's more difficult to create firms. Whereas if you're low value, it's better. So you want to be at the lowest end of the scale in this graph. And if you look at, in particular, competition, barriers to competition in service continue to be very high in many countries, and which means in many activities, service activities, it's too difficult to enter these areas, and also difficult to compete with the incumbents. Another area that we think it is important, there's too many barriers to competition and to entry in energy, telecom, and transportation sectors, which are key sectors, sometimes called also network sectors across the economy. And so we think this is an area where countries can work very closely to make sure that these barriers come down. And also finally, this graph tells the picture what happens regarding lobbying regulation. Remember, strong, transparent lobbying regulation implies that incumbent firms that usually have more lobbying power and means to do lobbying will be in the same level playing field if you have a good lobbying regulation. On the contrary, if you have an intransparent or not enough lobbying regulations, that means that especially the SMEs likely will not be able to do the lobbying to be in the same level playing field. So, good lobbying regulation is absolutely essential, not only to promote the culture of integrity, but also for competition, to create jobs, to create more investment. So lobbying and accountability of lobbying should be improved in many countries of the world. Why am I talking so much about these barriers and red tape and so on? What is the impact? What is the real impact, you ask me? Well, I can show in the next graph. The next graph on the left-hand side tells you if you do reforms, if you are in the OECD countries and you want to move to the 5 best OECD best practices in all these areas, you can see that you can have an increase of 3% in GDP per capita over the next 10 or 15 years if you do reform in these areas. If you cut down the red tape on creation of firms, if you lower barriers to service, lower barriers to competition, this is what you get. And if you are an EME, if you are an emerging market economy, the payoff is much bigger. In fact, you can see that payoff to productivity, to growth, and to employment is going to be so significant that growth will go up by about 7% GDP per capita. So it's a significant one. So final word is that reforms pay off. There has been some reluctance of reforms in the past few years. It's time to turn the corner. It's time to go back to reforms. To sum up, we have a picture of growth, of resilient growth. Inflation is coming down. Trade is doing better. And we know that labor markets are easing. So that basically we have a benign picture in terms of growth. But we still think that growth can still do better. In order to do better, we need to revive investment. And we need to make sure that we have good policies. In terms of policy, we think that monetary policy should, there's room to lower rates, but there's room also, it's important to stay prudent. Fiscal policy should turn the corner, and we should go back to fiscal discipline and prudence. And on the other hand, in particular, it's absolutely essential to go back to reforms.